sleet ran down Catherine Webber's collar in thin needling threads as she hurried behind Lady Webber's carriage, one gloved hand clamped around a lacquered box of pearls, the other gathering a skirt already dark with street water. The lamps along Hanover Street burned through the wet like bruised moons. Wheels struck ruts, mud spattered her hem. Her shoes had rubbed her heels raw before she reached the assembly rooms, and each step now felt precise and hot, as if a knife edge had found the same place again and again. She was 22 years old, hungry enough to taste iron at the back of her mouth, and carrying jewels worth more than the income her father had once paid 3 tenant farms to maintain. No one in the passing line of coaches looked at her directly. They looked through her, past her, then back once, because there was something in her face that paused them, despite themselves. A pale severity under dark hair pinned too tightly, and grave eyes that held candlelight when it found them. That second look never lasted. A footman opened the side entrance. Lady Webber did not turn. Catherine followed the pearls inside. Heat struck her first, then scent. Wax and perfume, wet wool steaming, orange peel, tobacco, wine, powder. The vestibule swelled with bodies and movement. Cloaks changed hands every second. Boots beat water onto tiled stone. A matron in emerald silk snapped for her fan and never saw who fetched it. Catherine delivered the pearl box to Lady Webber's waiting maid, received no acknowledgement, and was at once given 3 tasks in 3 different tones by 3 women who assumed she belonged to all of them. A torn lace cuff needed mending before the next set. 2 shawls needed carrying to the retiring room on the upper gallery. A silver clasp had broken. She was sent for a pin, then another, then sent back because the first pin was common. She stood with bent head while a girl younger than she was laughed that Miss Webber was so useful when one does not wish to ring. Catherine answered, "Yes, miss," because the answer cost less than truth. By the time the first quadrille ended, her fingers had begun to sting from damp thread, pulled too quickly through skin. Inside the ballroom, chandeliers threw hard light over polished floors and powdered shoulders, and music moved like a bright machine that did not pause for breath. Catherine crossed its edges only when summoned. She remained where she was told, near the musicians' stair and out of the dance lanes, holding wraps, returning gloves, fetching smelling salts, passing from one invisible duty to another without owning any of them. She was neither guest nor servant. She had no livery and no partner. She was addressed as Miss when form demanded it, and treated as furniture when convenience preferred it. When she stood still for more than a minute, someone found use for her. When she moved too quickly, someone told her she was in the way. At one point, she watched a pair of sisters sweep past in white gauze and seed pearls, their laughter bright as cut glass, and for one startled instant she remembered the long mirror in her father's morning room and her own hand, smaller then, flattening a crease in her mother's dance glove. The memory hit with physical force. She lowered her eyes and shifted the shawls on her arm before anyone could read her face. The year before her father died, the house on Pember Lane had still been warm in winter. Fires in both drawing rooms, ledgers balanced by Michaelmas. Tenants paid in grain when coin was tight, and he accepted grain because he understood hunger as arithmetic rather than failure. Fever took him in 8 days. Debt notices arrived in 6 weeks. Her mother remarried in panic, then died in childbirth before a year had turned. Lady Webber entered the house with trunks of lavender-scented silk and a tone of practical grief that hardened into governance by the 2nd month. The library was inventoried and sold shelf by shelf, save for legal volumes too dull for auction, and one atlas with a cracked spine no one wanted. Her father's study was locked, The key hung at Lady Webber's waist beside a silver vinaigrette. Meals changed first in quality, then in quantity. Broth and crusts for Catherine in the morning room after others had eaten. 1 egg on Sundays, if guests were not expected. Every caller heard the same sentence in some polished variation. Miss Webber remains with us out of charity. Catherine stopped correcting it aloud. She corrected only in private, by copying from memory at night the figures she had once seen in estate ledgers, the rents that had come in on time, the expenses that had not then existed, the signatures that began after her father's death to alter shape like a hand learning to imitate itself. By the 2nd week of February, she had grown used to performing usefulness, while her stomach folded inward on itself. The body adapted with humiliating efficiency. Hunger ceased to roar and settled into a steady pull under her ribs. Cold ceased to shock and became background. What remained sharp were particulars. The wet seam of her right glove rubbing skin from the knuckle. The pinch of stays let out too many times and still too tight. The ache in her shoulders from carrying parcels through crowds that opened for titled men and closed at once for women without consequence. Tonight those particulars multiplied. A pin slipped and dug beneath her thumbnail. She bled into handkerchief linen and turned the cloth to hide it. She carried a tray of untouched sugared almonds from one table to another and felt saliva rise at the smell before she swallowed it down. She stood near the sideboard while 2 gentlemen discussed horseflesh, and one said, not quietly, that Lady Webber's eldest stepdaughter had a face meant for governessing and a figure too thin for trouble. They were not entirely wrong. She was thin, and trouble had already taken root around her years before she could name it. She set down the tray and walked away with her back straight, because posture was the one inheritance no creditor could seize. Lady Webber's rustle was always audible before she appeared. Tonight it came with lavender and a hard fan tap at Catherine's elbow. "You are not to stand idle," Lady Webber said, without looking at her. The woman's smile remained fixed on a passing Viscountess. "Miss Eliza has torn her sleeve. Mend it in the vestibule." "At once?" Catherine accepted the sleeve. "Yes, Lady Webber." The corridor outside the ballroom was cooler, lit by a row of wall sconces that threw wavering light over plaster and gilt. She sat on a narrow bench and set to work, needle in, needle out, tiny stitches hidden in satin folds. Her hands shook once from cold. She steadied them against her knees and continued. 2 footmen passed carrying a punch bowl and did not lower their voices. "That one belongs to the house, does she not?" "Belongs to debt, more like." Catherine kept sewing. She had learned that humiliation delivered in plain speech struck less deeply than whispered pity. Pity implied surprise. There was no surprise left in any of this. When she finished the sleeve, she returned it to Miss Eliza, who took it without thanks, and lifted her arm to inspect the seam as if checking market lace. "Acceptable," the girl said. Catherine inclined her head and stepped back. The orchestra moved into another set, another. Couples formed and broke and formed again. She took 3 cloaks to the retiring room, descended the service stair to fetch fresh candles when asked, and passed through a knot of dowagers discussing settlements with the intensity of military planners. No one asked whether she had eaten. No one offered wine. A maid in the retiring room, older and kind-eyed, pressed half a roll into Catherine's hand while pretending to adjust a sash. Catherine looked up in surprise. The maid shook her head once, warning silence. Catherine hid the bread in her pocket and waited until she reached the unlit end of the corridor near the musicians' cases before she ate. 2 bites, dry, stale, enough to stop the trembling for 10 minutes. She brushed crumbs from her glove and returned to the light. Near midnight, the 3rd quadrille began. Violins climbed, shoes struck in bright, practised patterns. Catherine stood by the musician's stair with a bundle of shawls over one arm and a basket of spare ribbons at her feet, still as a carved figure in a niche, while silk rustled past in waves and names were announced in tones she had once heard from her own front hall. Baron this, Lady that, son of, heir to, widow of. Her father's drawing-room had held those names before fever, before creditors, before her mother's frightened marriage and brief grave. She knew this with exhausted precision now. The winter assembly was not celebration. It was transaction dressed in candlelight. Men came to inspect dowries. Women came to secure promises. Debts changed hands without ink. Tonight Lady Webber had brought her for the same purpose she brought account books and polished silver, to make an argument of solvency and obedience in public. Catherine felt that truth settled in her like stone. The basket handle bit into her palm. Her heels throbbed. Her stomach tightened again around emptiness. She lifted her chin and kept her place, because she had not yet been dismissed, and in Lady Webber's house even breathing unbidden could be called defiance. A strain in the violin line turned minor and held there, and Catherine felt her breath catch as if the room itself had tightened stays around her ribs. The melody was one her father had favoured in winter, played softly after supper while account books lay open at his elbow, and she, still in braids, read columns aloud when his eyes tired. She had learned figures before she learned flirtation. Yields by acre, repairs by quarter, which tenant paid late and why, which roof could wait, which widow could not. He had called stewardship a moral discipline, not a social ornament, and he had said it in that same drawing-room where Lady Webber now staged polished hunger and called it rescue. Catherine watched a baronet's son laugh over cards beside a table once paid for from her father's rents, watched a girl in crystal beads complain that the room was too warm while Catherine's fingers remained cold inside wet gloves, and knew with the clarity of pain that inheritance could be stolen long before courts admitted it. It could be stolen by repetition, by saying burden often enough that even the burden began to answer to it. Her name had narrowed to usefulness in this house, yet memory refused to narrow with it. A pair of sisters crossed the edge of her vision. Eliza first, fair and bright in pale blue gauze, then Margaret in primrose silk with seed pearls sewn thick at the neckline. Both gowns had been altered from older pieces Catherine remembered folded in cedar in her mother's wardrobe. She knew the pattern of stitches at the cuffs. She knew the faint watermark hidden near one hem, where, years ago, she had knocked over tea and cried over the damage until her mother laughed and kissed her forehead and said fabric survived more than girls believed. The mark had been turned inward by a clever seamstress. No one else could have found it. Eliza lifted her chin as she passed and let her gaze settle on Catherine for one flat second, long enough to communicate possession without speech. Margaret did not look at all. That was her chosen cruelty, more efficient than taunts. To look at Catherine would have admitted relation, and relation was an inconvenience in rooms where alliances were marketed in candlelight. Catherine lowered her eyes before either could speak. She did not lower them from shame. She lowered them to keep from naming what she saw out loud. Her mother's opal comb in Eliza's hair, her mother's winter mantle cut down for Margaret's figure, and around Lady Webber's throat across the room, the narrow gold chain her father had given his wife on their 5th anniversary, now worn as if history had no witnesses. "Miss Webber." The summons came from Lady Penhurst, an ally when status required one and a stranger at every other hour. Catherine stepped forward. "My lady, you will carry these to the retiring room carefully. They are Brussels." 2 lace shawls were dropped into her arms, as if weight belonged naturally there. Lady Penhurst turned to the woman beside her and spoke in a stage whisper sharp enough to travel. Lady Weber's stepdaughter has the useful constitution, no delicacy to interfere with duty. The companions smiled with small, neat teeth. How fortunate for households in reduced circumstances! Catherine curtsied. Her knees ached from standing, and the movement still came exact. She took the shawls up the narrow stair where servants and lesser relations passed each other sideways and breathless, set them in the appointed room, and paused one heartbeat at the mirror near the washstand. The glass was old and faintly warped. It gave her back a face drawn thinner than her memory allowed, dark hair pinned too hard at the temples, a mouth schooled into neutrality. Plain, they called her. Plain enough to order, plain enough to forget. Yet strangers looked twice, then away, and that second look had become another offence she paid for. Lady Weber said beauty was a currency Catherine had no right to spend. So she spent none of it. She moved through rooms with her shoulders in and her voice low, and let people call restraint humility, because the alternative was accusation. On her way down, she passed the closed door of the card room and heard her stepmother's laugh, bright and deliberate, the laugh she used when numbers turned in her favour. Catherine slowed without meaning to. Through the narrow gap, where the door had not fully latched, she saw Lady Weber seated beneath a wall sconce, fan half open, Mr. Hargreave from Bishop Street leaning toward her with a packet of folded papers tied in red ribbon, and Lord Wrexham himself at the table edge, with a tired face and restless fingers drumming walnut wood. The ribbon was familiar, legal office ribbon. Mr. Hargreave untied it and tapped one document with a ringed forefinger. Lady Weber nodded once. Wrexham did not smile. Catherine moved on before she could be seen, but the image struck deep because she had once found a bundle tied with that same red ribbon on the locked study desk when the locksmith came to oil hinges. She had read only the heading before footsteps approached. Memorandum of Advance Against Anticipated Dowry Assets. Her own initials had appeared in the margin, penned by another hand. She had not slept that night. She had copied what she remembered at dawn on scrap paper and hidden it inside the atlas with the cracked spine between maps of counties she no longer controlled. Debt had been spoken in that house for years as weather, as fate, as a widow's burden. Yet debt had signatures, debt had dates, debt had witnesses willing to look away. By the first week of January she had begun to wake with figures already running through her mind before her feet touched floorboards, and the habit had followed her into this ballroom like an ache in bone. She set down the arithmetic now in silence while men toasted and women danced. 2 tenant leases terminated and never renewed, though rents had been paid. 1 field sold below value to a cousin of Mr. Hargreave. 3 silver pieces from the old dining service missing from inventory, then listed as household losses due to theft, though no servant had been dismissed. Her mother's books sold to Armitage's shop by lot, not by title, which meant they vanished cheap into other homes. First editions split from annotations in her father's hand. The portrait of Catherine's grandmother moved from the morning room to an attic passage, then gone entirely. The pianoforte sent for repair never returned. A locked drawer emptied, a cellar ledger rewritten. She had traced these changes the way a doctor traced fever, not one event, but pattern. Pattern proved intention. Intent proved blame. Still, proof in her pocket remained only paper until a man of rank decided it was proof. Lady Weber understood that better than anyone. She hosted, she smiled, she spent visibly and cut invisibly, and she kept Catherine thin because thin girls argued less loudly. A footman approached with a silver tray and stopped short when he recognised her. He could not have been older than 20. "Miss Weber," he murmured, almost apologetic, and offered 1 glass of watered wine left untouched by a departing guest. She hesitated. Hunger and caution warred. Then she took it. "Thank you." She drank in 2 controlled swallows, warmth spreading through an empty stomach so fast it hurt. The footman inclined his head and moved on before any lady could accuse him of familiarity. Catherine set the glass aside and pressed her thumb to the bruise darkening at her wrist, where Lady Webber had gripped her earlier in the cloakroom for bringing the wrong ribbon colour. Violet now. It would yellow by morning. She adjusted her cuff to cover it and resumed her post. From below the stair came Eliza's voice, pitched for companions but aimed with intent. "Do not leave your reticule unattended. We have had small losses in houses where dependents wander." Laughter followed, delicate and clean. Catherine looked down and met Eliza's gaze fully this time. Her stepsister blinked first, then turned away with a shrug that conveyed boredom she did not feel. Margaret added, "Mamma says charity requires vigilance." More laughter. The words landed where they were meant to land, in the ears of strangers who liked their cruelty plausible. Catherine had once shared nursery stories with these girls. She had mended Margaret's doll when its head came loose. She had taught Eliza to tie a sailor knot from a picture in one of her father's travel books, before that book was sold. Memory did not soften them. It only sharpened the absurdity of this performance, sisters recast as patrons, kin recast as threat. Catherine bent to retrieve a fallen ribbon and felt heat crawl up her throat, not from tears, from fury held too long behind her teeth. She swallowed it. Fury fed on itself when unfed by action. Action, for now, meant survival in increments. She had saved 6 shillings in 3 years from mending done quietly for kitchen maids and stable boys, who paid in coppers and gratitude. She had hidden the coins in a hollow behind loose wainscot beneath the attic stair. She had copied rent rolls by candle end and taught herself to compare signatures by stroke and pressure. She had memorised the names of magistrates known to dislike scandal and the clerks who carried news between offices for half a crown. She had written 1 letter and not sent it, addressed to Mr. Ames, her father's former steward now retired to Bath, because asking for help could expose him to retaliation and expose her to immediate expulsion. Lady Webber had made the threat clear each time obedience wavered. A trunk by the door, no reference, no roof. The street in February. A woman alone with no character certificate. Catherine understood precisely what that meant. She had seen women folded into workhouses by spring and buried by winter. So she stayed. She observed. She endured what could be endured. Endurance was not surrender when directed toward a ledger's final line. Music surged, then broke into applause. Dancers changed partners. A draught swept from the entry corridor and touched the damp at Catherine's neck, cold enough to raise a shiver she tried to suppress. She lifted another shawl, settled it over Lady Penhurst's shoulders, accepted no thanks, and stepped back into her pocket of shadow near the stair. Across the ballroom, Lady Webber moved through a circle of men with practised ease, hand resting lightly on Wrexham's sleeve, as if they shared confidence. Catherine watched the angle of her stepmother's chin, the placement of her smile, the measured delay before each reply. Negotiation. Always negotiation. Even grief had been negotiated in that house. How long mourning black would be worn, which portraits draped, which not, when creditors could be admitted through the front door again without damaging prospects. Her mother had still been warm in the churchyard when Lady Webber began speaking of practicalities. "Your father trusted me," she had said, fingers already on key and account. Catherine had believed her for 1 month. By the second, she had found a pawn ticket in the writing desk for her mother's wedding silver, signed not by necessity, but by convenience. By the 6th, She had learned that truth in a powerless mouth was called insolence. "Miss Weber!" Lady Weber had appeared at her shoulder without sound, lavender cutting through wax and wine. Her fan was closed now, a white rod against black silk. Up close, powder softened the edges of her face, but did not hide calculation in her eyes. "You have been standing there as if carved. Come, there is work suited to your talents." The words were smooth enough for any nearby listener to mishear as praise. Her fingers settled over Catherine's bruised wrist with precise pressure, not enough to draw notice, enough to remind. Catherine inclined her head. "Yes, Lady Weber." Eliza and Margaret flanked their mother at a distance, bright as painted figures and just as merciful. Around them the room continued its glittering commerce, unaware or unwilling. Catherine let herself be guided 2 steps, 3 into the edge of the crowd, every nerve alert in the way of animals that smell weather before rain. Lady Weber bent nearer, smile fixed for the room, and her whisper brushed Catherine's ear like a blade being tested for sharpness. "Listen carefully," Lady Weber whispered, her smile still fixed toward the dance floor. "You will cross this room now. You will curtsy to Lord Wrexham by the card-room doors. You will say that Mr. Hargreave has delayed the transfer only for want of a signature from York, and that all sums are secure against my late husband's northern rents. You will repeat it word for word. If you alter 1 syllable, you will not sleep under my roof tonight." Her nails pressed into Catherine's bruised wrist, sharp through wet glove. Music swelled around them. No one turned, no one ever turned, when cruelty was done in a civilized tone. Catherine felt the pressure travel up her forearm like heat. Lady Weber lowered her voice further, each word measured. "Do not tremble. Men smell fear and call it deceit. Smile once, not too warmly. Then leave him and return to the stare. You are useful only when silent." Catherine's throat tightened. "My lady, I am not presented to Lord Wrexham." "You are presented when I require it." Lady Weber's fan struck Catherine's sleeve as if dusting lint. "Go." Eliza stood 2 paces away, pretending to admire the chandeliers. Margaret studied her gloves as though stitching their deserved scholarly attention. Both listened. Both heard. Neither spoke. Catherine looked once toward the ballroom doors where cold air leaked in each time a footman admitted another guest. The night outside was sleet and black stone. Lady Weber had chosen her threat well. There were hours until dawn. There were fewer places for a cast-off woman than for a lame horse in February London. "Now," Lady Weber said. Catherine moved. The set in the centre had just broken. Couples drifted to the edges in bright clusters, laughing into fans, bowing, collecting dropped programmes. She slipped between silk and black broadcloth with the skill of one who had spent years navigating rooms where she had no right to occupy space. Her heels burned with each step. Her right shoe had begun to rub damp wool against raw skin, and the friction sent a clean line of pain up her calf. She did not slow. The lie sat in her mouth like chalk. "Mr. Hargreave has delayed the transfer only for want of a signature from York, all sums secure against northern rents." She repeated it in rhythm with the music, forcing the words into place before fear could scatter them. A gentleman she did not know shifted aside at the last moment and clipped her shoulder with his sleeve. A drop of wine struck her cuff. Someone laughed behind her, not unkindly at some separate remark. The room blurred for a breath and sharpened again. She fixed her gaze on the card-room entrance, where 3 men stood in conversation. One was Lord Wrexham, she thought, from the profile she had seen through the half-latched door. Tired eyes, thinning, fair hair, fingers that tapped wood as if counting loss. Beside him stood a narrower man in bottle green, likely Mr. Hargreave, and with them Slightly apart was a man she had not seen before, taller by a head, dark hair brushed straight from a broad brow, shoulders held with military stillness that made the space around him feel colder than the rest of the room. By the time the orchestra modulated into the next figure, Catherine had crossed half the floor and could no longer retreat without being seen to retreat. Her pulse hammered at her throat. She reached the three men just as a footman passed behind her with a tray of glasses, and the candlelight from the nearest sconce struck her face and hands in full. She felt the exposure like a hand between her shoulder blades. She dropped into a curtsy before the tall, dark-haired man, because he had turned toward her first and because urgency had narrowed judgment to the nearest pair of attentive eyes. "My lord," she said, voice steady by effort alone, "Lady Webber asks that I assure you Mr. Hargreave has delayed the transfer only for want of a signature from York. All sums are secure against her late husband's northern rents." Silence met her. Not long. Long enough. She rose slowly. The tall man was watching her with a focus so complete it felt physical. His face might have been carved from winter stone. Dark coat, plain for evening. No ostentatious jewel. Only a signet ring and a thin white scar drawn from the corner of his jaw toward his ear, pale against skin, weathered by old wind. His eyes were not the light blue she expected from ballroom portraits. They were deeper, slate before rain. They moved once from her face to her wrist where Lady Webber's fingers had marked her through glove and lace, then back to her eyes. "Rise, Miss Webber," he said. His voice was low, clipped, and carried farther than it should have in the crowd. "Continue." The word struck harder than rebuke. He hadn't corrected her title. He had not turned to expose her error. He had invited it to unfold. Catherine opened her mouth and found that breath had gone shallow. "My lord, I have conveyed the message entire." "Have you?" He did not ask it as a question. He held her gaze another beat, then shifted his attention over her shoulder toward the ballroom, where Lady Webber stood framed by a cluster of listeners, fan poised, smile arranged. When he looked back, his expression had not changed, yet something in it had sharpened. "Who instructed you to say those words?" The bottle-green gentleman gave a small cough. Lord Wrexham, now unmistakable at Catherine's right, stared at her with open bewilderment. Two ladies passing nearby slowed. A dowager's brows climbed. Catherine felt the social geometry rearrange around her in real time, lines of rank and peril redrawn with each second she remained in that place. She answered the only way she could without detonating the room. "I carry messages as directed, my lord." "Directed by whom?" Her fingers tightened around the shawl bundle until her knuckles hurt. She could feel Lady Webber's gaze from across the floor, hard as a pin through fabric. "I am not at liberty to say." The tall man's mouth moved a fraction. Not quite a smile. Nothing so merciful. "You are at liberty now." He took one step closer. Not enough to touch, enough that she caught the scent of cold wool and rain dried by fire. The heat of the room pressed at her back, yet her skin prickled along her arms, as if a draught had reached her through stone. At the edge of her vision, a pair of younger men bowed to him in passing and received no acknowledgement. A woman in silver whispered, "Your Grace," to her companion as they moved on, and the title struck Catherine with a force that left her momentarily unmoored. Your Grace, Adrian Thorne, Duke of Norfield. The war hero whose name was spoken in Parliament, drawing rooms and dockside taverns alike. The widower who had buried his wife and withdrawn from half the season's invitations. The man mothers warned daughters about in opposite ways, some as danger, some as salvation, all with equal certainty that his regard altered futures. the one man in the room to whom Lord Wrexham would bow first and Speaker second. Catherine's stomach dropped so abruptly she thought she might sway. She had curtsied to the wrong man in the centre of a negotiation designed to hide fraud. She had delivered Lady Webber's script into the hands of the one person with enough power to crush it in public. Shame rose hot under her skin. She lowered her eyes, then forced them up again because fear read as guilt in courts and in ballrooms alike. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "I beg your pardon. I mistook—" "You did not mistake," he said. The interruption was clean, final. He had turned slightly so that his body cut her from direct view of half the room, a movement so economical many would not register it as deliberate. His gaze returned to her wrist. "How long since that bruise was made?" she swallowed. "It is nothing." "Liar!" The word was soft. It still landed like steel on tile. Colour rose in her cheeks, anger now as much as humiliation. "I did not ask for your concern, Your Grace." "No," he said, "you did not." Wrexham shifted his weight, uneasy, and addressed the Duke with forced lightness. "Norfield, if this is about the transfer draft, I am sure Lady Webber can clarify. The young lady is merely conveying family detail." "A family detail," the Duke repeated, still watching Catherine. "An apt phrase." Mr. Hargreaves stepped in then, a smile too quick. "Your Grace, paperwork often sounds blunt in polite rooms. It is unfortunate. We should not distress Miss Webber with figures." "Yet you attached her name to them." The Duke's attention moved to him for the first time. "Do not insult us both, Hargreave." The solicitor's smile faltered. Around them, conversation had thinned into pockets of deliberate ignorance. People were listening while pretending to inspect flowers, gloves, the direction of the dance. Catherine heard the scrape of a chair from inside the card-room, the clink of glass, the orchestra pressing on with professional indifference. By the last week of February, she had taught herself to read danger by silence more than noise, and this silence was the dangerous kind, the kind that could turn one sentence into ruin or reprieve. The Duke spoke again without looking away from her. "Miss Webber, answer precisely. Were you threatened if you refused that message?" Every lesson Lady Webber had enforced rose in Catherine at once. Never accuse without witness. Never contradict your benefactor in public. Never forget who controls your next meal, your bed, your name. Yet another lesson, older and quieter, surfaced beneath the rest in her father's voice. Stewardship is moral discipline. Figures are promises to living people. A lie on paper is a theft from mouths you may never see. She drew breath that hurt her ribs and chose the narrow truth. "I was told I would be turned into the street before dawn if I altered the message." Something hard moved across the Duke's face, not surprise, not pity. Recognition, perhaps, of a pattern he had expected and heard confirmed. He inclined his head once, as if marking an entry in a ledger only he could see. "Good," he said. The word startled her more than anger would have. "Good," he repeated lower. "You will remain where I can see you." Catherine blinked. "Your Grace!" He shifted his stance, scanning the crowd with that same soldier's economy. And when his eyes returned to her, they were colder than before, though his next command was unmistakably protective. "Do not return to Lady Webber's side," Wrexham exhaled sharply. Hargreave began. "Your Grace, this is unnecessary." "Be silent." Hargreave obeyed. Catherine felt the room tilt under the weight of what had just occurred. To stand near the Duke unbidden invited gossip. To disobey Lady Webber invited immediate retaliation. To move now in either direction was to choose a visible allegiance she had not asked to make. Her hands trembled once. She stilled them against the shawls. Across the ballroom, Lady Webber's smile remained in place for her audience, but her eyes had gone flat and bright, fixed on Catherine and the Duke with a concentration that promised reckoning. The Duke followed Catherine's line of sight and spoke without turning his head. "Look at me, Miss Webber." She did. "If she approaches you, step behind me." The command froze her in place more surely than fear had done. He added, after the smallest pause, "That is not a request." Catherine stood where he had placed her, shawls gathered against her ribs, every muscle held taut against the urge to step back into shadow. The Duke's shoulder was a wall between her and half the room. Wrexham had gone pale around the mouth. Hargreave looked as if he wished to vanish into his own collar. Across the floor Lady Webber began to move toward them, fan closed, smile bright enough to pass for calm at a distance, and brittle enough to cut at close range. She arrived with 2 matrons in her wake, Eliza and Margaret just behind, all of them carrying the same careful expression society women wore when they approached scandal, and hoped to name it misunderstanding before it named them. "Your Grace," Lady Webber said, dipping into a shallow curtsy, "I fear my stepdaughter has interrupted private business. The child grows fanciful when overtired. Miss Webber, come here." The Duke did not turn his head. "She remains." The 2 matrons glanced at one another, and then at Catherine, trying to recalculate her value in real time. Lady Webber's smile did not move. Only her eyes did. "You are kind," she said to the Duke, "but I assure you she is apt to dramatise. A weak constitution and too many novels in girlhood." Catherine felt the old instinct to agree, to lower her head and make herself small enough to survive the hour. It rose and met the Duke's last command, still ringing in her ears. "That is not a request." For one suspended second she understood that obedience, for once, might mean disobeying the woman who had ruled her breath for years. "I am not unwell," she said quietly. "I shall remain where I was instructed." Lady Webber's fan tip touched her own glove with a soft tap. "Miss Webber, do not be absurd." "Do not address her," the Duke said, still calm. "Address me." The words landed over polished floorboards and silenced the nearest circle of listeners. No one moved. The orchestra continued for 3 bars on sheer habit, then faltered when the first violinist looked up and saw the knot of titled stillness by the card-room doors. What happened next came from the far side of the room, sudden and ordinary and catastrophic in the way small accidents become disasters in crowded spaces. A young boy, perhaps 8, slipped free of a nursemaid's distracted hand and ran along the edge of the dance lane to retrieve a toy soldier dropped near the musician's stair. At that same instant, a footman carrying punch was jostled by a retreating guest. The tray tipped. Glass struck marble. Shards skipped across the floor. The boy hit the slick spill and went down hard with a cry that cut through every layered conversation in the room. People recoiled at once. Silk skirts swept back. Gentlemen stepped away to save their shoes. Someone exclaimed that the child would stain the carpet. Someone else called for a servant, but no one bent. Catherine was already moving. The shawls fell from her arms to the nearest chair. She crossed the few yards at a run, dropped to her knees in spilled punch and broken crystal, and reached for the boy before he could thrash his hand into sharper edges. He was white with shock, breath broken into sobbing gulps, one glove torn and darkening fast at the palm. "I have you," she said. "I do not clutch. Let me see." He tried to pull away, frightened more by strangers looking down than by pain itself. Catherine cupped his wrist, gentle and firm, and turned his hand toward the light. The cut was long but clean. Blood welled quickly, bright against kid leather and lace cuff. Not mortal, frightening enough to panic a room that feared disorder more than injury. "Thomas!" a woman's voice cried from somewhere behind Catherine. "Thomas, dear God!" The nursemaid reached them then, shaking so badly she could barely kneel. Catherine looked up once. "Hold his shoulders. Speak softly. Do not let him watch his hand." The woman obeyed at once, as if the authority in Catherine's voice left no room for social ranking. Catherine stripped off her own glove with her teeth, pressed the heel of her bare palm over the wound, and spoke to the boy in a tone she had not used in years, the tone from winter nights beside her father's fire when tenant children came feverish and frightened, and he needed her calm more than her arithmetic. "Look at me, Thomas. Not there. Here. You are brave. Breathe with me." He stared at her with wet, stunned eyes and tried to match her count. A cluster formed around them, useless and loud. Advice rained from above like hail. Brandy, vinegar, salts. "Move him, do not move him. Where is his mother? Where is the surgeon?" Catherine blocked it out and looked for what she needed. Clean cloth, water, space. "Boiled water, if the kitchen has it," she said to the nearest footman. "If not, the cleanest water immediately. And bring lint from the retiring room chest, quickly." The footman ran. Lady Webber's voice floated over the crowd, edged with fury, masked as decorum. "Miss Weber, stand up this instant. You are making a spectacle." Catherine did not look up. "He is hurt. He is attended. You are kneeling in the middle of the assembly like a kitchen girl." "He needs pressure now," Catherine said, still to the child. "Not in 5 minutes." Eliza made a small sound of disgust. Margaret murmured that blood was everywhere, though it was not. The stain sat mostly on Catherine's hand, her cuff, the hem of her dress, where she knelt in the spill. A movement at the edge of her vision told her the Duke had crossed behind the ring of onlookers. She did not turn. She could feel the change in the crowd's posture before she saw him, bodies straightening, voices thinning, rank remembering itself. "Back," he said. One word. The circle opened. He stood near enough now that Catherine saw the polished toe of his boot beside broken glass. "Leave him," he said. "My physician is being summoned." She shook her head once, eyes on Thomas. "If I remove pressure, it will bleed again." His pause lasted a breath. 2. "Proceed." The command held no resistance this time. By the first quarter hour after midnight, the heat inside the ballroom had turned heavy with wax and fear, and Catherine's damp hair had begun to loosen at the nape. She did not feel it. She felt only the small tremor in the boy's arm and the slippery pulse of blood easing under her hand as pressure took hold. The footman returned with a basin and folded linen torn from old sheets. Catherine rinsed quickly, wiped away punch and glass dust, checked for embedded fragments, found one tiny sliver near the thumb, and lifted it with the tip of a hairpin passed by the nursemaid. Thomas whimpered. Catherine leaned close and began to hum under her breath, very low, the German cradle song her father had used when storms rattled the shutters, and sleep would not come. Schlaf, kleines Herz, der Wind geht leis. Schlaf, kleines Herz, die Nacht ist weiß. The words came before she could stop them. A private language in a public room, a song she had not sung since his death. Thomas's breathing slowed to match the rhythm. His fingers unclenched by degrees. Someone behind her said, surprised, "Is that German?" Another answered, "Who knew she had any education at all?" Catherine ignored both. She wrapped the cloth around Thomas's palm in firm turns, tied it above the wrist with a strip torn from the inner hem of her underskirt, then checked capillary return as her father had taught her, pressing each fingertip and watching colour return. Good. He would keep full use if infection did not set in. She looked to the nursemaid. He must not use this hand tonight. Change the dressing at dawn. Keep it dry. If fever comes, send for a surgeon without delay. The nursemaid nodded, through tears. Yes, miss. Yes. At last Catherine lifted her head. The room tilted briefly from standing too fast after kneeling on stone. She caught herself on a chair back and found the Duke watching her with an intensity that made speech feel fragile. He had not moved far from where he first stopped. His face remained hard, unreadable to anyone who did not know what to look for. But his hands were bare now. He had removed his gloves and held them crushed in one fist, as if he had forgotten them there. Lady Webber swept forward before Catherine could rise fully. Lavender and silk and anger arrived in one rustling surge. "This has gone on long enough," she said. "Miss Webber will apologise for this display and return to her duties." Thomas, bandaged and pale, clung to Catherine's sleeve. "Do not send her away," he whispered, too low for most to hear. Lady Webber heard. Her mouth tightened. Children attached to any novelty. Catherine eased the boy's hand into the nursemaid's care and stood slowly, knees aching, palm stinging where glass had scored it in two shallow lines. She dipped her head to Thomas first, then turned to Lady Webber. "I shall apologise if you wish," she said, "but not for stopping his bleeding." "You will apologise for disobedience." The word struck old bruises. Catherine felt the familiar pull toward silence, toward placation, toward the script that had preserved her roof at the cost of herself. She also felt Thomas's small grip, marks on her sleeve, the warmth of his skin where panic had ebbed, and the fact of 30 witnesses who had seen who moved and who stepped back. "No," she said. It was a quiet word. It carried farther than shouting. Lady Webber's nostrils flared. "You forget your place. My place was beside the child on the floor." A murmur moved through the onlookers, not approval yet, but the first shift in pressure when a room senses hierarchy moving under its feet. Wrexham stared at Catherine as if seeing her for the first time. Hargreave looked fixedly at the nearest sconce. Lady Webber took one step closer and lowered her voice, though anger roughened it. "You insolent girl! You would defy me before all London for a stranger's brat and a man who does not know your value from a ribbon clerk's?" Catherine's pulse jumped. The insult to the child she could bear. The contempt for truth she could not. She answered before caution could close her throat. His Grace knows enough to tell blood from punch and coercion, from courtesy. The silence after that line was absolute. Lady Webber's hand lifted, swift and precise, aimed for Catherine's cheek with the same practised force used in private corridors where no one counted. Catherine saw it coming and did not flinch. She had been struck before. She knew the arc. The blow did not land. A larger hand caught Lady Webber's wrist in mid-air, fingers closing just above her bracelets. The Duke had moved without visible transition, one instant still, the next between them. His jaw had gone rigid enough that the old scar stood pale and sharp against his skin. "You will not touch Miss Webber again," he said. Every syllable was flat, final. The nursemaid pressed Thomas to her skirts and backed away. Eliza looked stunned. Margaret's lips parted and stayed open, no sound emerging. Lady Webber tried to recover dignity by force of posture. "Your Grace releases me. This is a family correction." "No," he said, "this is assault in a public room." He let her wrist go as if contamination offended him, then turned to the doorway where a grey-haired physician was hurrying through the parted crowd. "Dr. Hale, examine the boy now." The physician knelt at once. Catherine stepped aside to give him space, then swayed once as the adrenaline left her legs. The Duke's gaze dropped to her blood-marked hand. "Sit. I am well. Sit." She sat because her knees threatened mutiny, and because he had spoken in that same tone with which commanders moved men under fire. A footman brought a chair without being asked. Another offered water. Catherine took the glass with her uninjured hand and drank, aware of a dozen eyes measuring each movement, updating old judgments. Dr. Hale looked up after a brief inspection. "The bandage is correct. Clean work. He will keep the hand if watched for fever." "Good," the Duke said. He did not look at the physician again. He looked at Catherine. The scrutiny should have felt like another violation. It did not. It felt like being read by someone who intended to use what he learned for action, not amusement. From somewhere to Catherine's left, one of the matrons who had come with Lady Webber spoke in a strained attempt at social repair. "Miss Weber was fortunate to have such practical instincts. Country girls do, I am told." Catherine might have let that pass 10 minutes earlier. Now she lifted her chin. "My father taught me wound care when tenants could not reach market surgeons in snow." The matron blinked. "Indeed." "Indeed," the Duke said. It was not loud. The woman coloured and fell silent. 2 minutes later, Thomas was carried toward the withdrawing room with his nursemaid and Dr. Hale. As he passed, he reached for Catherine again. She squeezed his uninjured fingers once and let go. The small trust in that gesture struck deeper than any public insult had, because it asked nothing and gave everything. The Duke watched the boy disappear behind the crowd, then addressed a footman near the entrance. "Bring my carriage to the side steps. Keep it there." Lady Webber, who had recovered enough to resume her polished voice, stepped forward with one last attempt to reclaim control. "Your Grace, there is no need for melodrama. Miss Weber returns home with me." "No," he said, one syllable again, a closed gate. "She will ride in my carriage." Catherine's breath caught. Around them, heads turned in a single ripple. Lady Webber's face changed, the social smile fracturing at last into naked calculation. She understood exactly what this meant. Not merely protection for a night, but removal from immediate reach under the eyes of witnesses she could not intimidate into forgetting. "My stepdaughter is not yours to command," Lady Webber said. The Duke's gaze did not leave Catherine. "Tonight she is under my protection." He took one measured step back, granting Catherine room to stand, and offered no hand. No softness, only the same severe certainty that had held the room in check since she crossed the floor. "Miss Weber," he said, "come." Catherine rose because he had commanded it, because 30 eyes were still on her, because her knees would buckle if she remained 1 second longer in that chair. She wiped her damp palm against the least stained fold of her skirt and stepped toward him. Lady Webber moved with her, silk whispering over wood, fan lifted like a small white blade. "This is indecent, Your Grace," Lady Webber said. "Miss Weber is of my household." The Duke did not raise his voice. "Miss Weber will collect her cloak and leave now." "She has no cloak fit for your carriage?" "Then she will wear mine." The words struck with the force of a public verdict. A murmur passed through the nearest guests, quickly smothered behind gloved hands. Catherine felt heat rise under her skin despite the cold sweat at her nape. Lady Webber's face held, then cracked at the edges. "You presume greatly on a moment's confusion." "I state what will occur." He turned his head a fraction toward Wrexham, who had lingered near the card-room threshold with the stunned look of a man who had wagered on one horse and seen another take the field. "My Lord Wrexham, you witnessed Lady Webber attempt to strike Miss Webber." Wrexham swallowed. "I witnessed raised tempers." The Duke's gaze remained on him, still and unblinking. "And the raised hand." A beat passed. Wrexham looked at the crowd, at Lady Webber, then down. "Yes, the raised hand." "Good," the Duke said. He inclined his head once to one of the matrons. "Madame, you stood within arm's length. You saw it also." The matron, trapped now between convenience and being called liar by a duke in public, gave the smallest possible nod. "I did." Lady Webber's fan snapped shut hard enough to echo. "You make theatre of household correction." "No," he said, "I prevent repetition." He stepped aside then, creating a narrow path through the bodies, not touching her, not guiding her with a hand at her back, simply standing where refusal became visible if she chose it. Catherine looked once at Lady Webber. Lavender, pearls, perfect posture. The same woman who had rationed her bread and called it discipline. The same hand that had risen for her face in a room full of witnesses. Catherine lowered her head in a formal curve that was not submission so much as closure. "Lady Weber!" She did not wait for permission. She walked. The crowd opened unevenly, some faces avid, some embarrassed, some carefully blank. Eliza stared as if Catherine had spoken in an unknown language. Margaret drew her shawl tighter and angled away, already rehearsing a version of events in which she had stood elsewhere. Hargreave had retreated to the card-room, his red ribbon packet gone from sight. Catherine marked that and stored it. Pattern, concealment, witness. By the first hour after midnight, sleet had thickened against the upper windows, turning the panes to blurred silver. The corridor beyond the ballroom was colder and smelled of wet wool and extinguished candles. Catherine's pulse still ran too fast from the scene on the floor with Thomas, from Lady Webber's lifted hand, from the Duke's voice cutting through both. She kept pace at his left shoulder, aware of every step because her right heel burned where the shoe had opened skin. He noticed. "You are limping," he said, without looking at her. "It is nothing, Your Grace." "Another lie." The word landed less like an insult now than an entry corrected in a ledger. Catherine felt a flicker of anger and relief in the same breath. At the cloakroom door a servant moved to intercept them, then froze when he recognised the Duke. "Your Grace!" "Miss Webber's things," he said. "Now." The servant glanced over Catherine's dress, the blood-dark smear at her cuff, the plain wool mantle hanging from a peg near the service entrance, rather than with the guest's furs. He hesitated just long enough for shame to sting. The Duke's tone did not change. "Now!" The mantle was produced at once, damp, thin, one button missing. Catherine reached for it with her uninjured hand and winced when her scraped palm brushed the coarse edge. The Duke saw that too. "Of course he saw. Give it here," he said. She stiffened. "Your Grace, I can manage." His eyes met hers, storm-grey and unreadable. "I did not ask whether you could. I ordered what will happen." He took the mantle, shook it once to settle the lining, and held it open. Catherine stood very still, then stepped into it because the corridor was full of watching servants, and because refusing would turn this into another spectacle. He set the wool over her shoulders with military precision, fastened the single surviving button, and stopped with his hand near her collarbone for the smallest fraction of a second, as if confirming that the fabric covered the torn edge of her bodice, where she had ripped cloth for bandages. Then he withdrew. A footman approached with his greatcoat. The Duke took it and draped it over Catherine's mantle before she could protest, heavy dark wool falling nearly to her ankles. "You will return this at Norfield House," he said. She looked up sharply. "I beg pardon." "You heard me." Her throat tightened. "I cannot go to your house." "You cannot return to hers." "That is not for you to decide." His jaw set. The scar along it turned pale. "Tonight it is." The carriage waited at the side steps, lanterns swinging in sleet. 2 grooms held the horses steady while wind drove needles of ice under the awning. The Duke took the first step down, turned, and offered his hand. Catherine hesitated only once, then placed her fingers in his. His grasp was firm, warm despite the cold, and released the instant she found her footing. No impropriety, no softness for the crowd to feed on, only efficiency, and beneath it a force that did not invite challenge. Inside the carriage, dark leather and banked heat closed around them. The door thudded shut. Wheels lurched into motion. For the first few streets neither spoke. Hoofbeats struck wet stone in a hard rhythm. Catherine sat opposite him, spine straight, hands in her lap, his coat heavy over her knees. Her teeth had begun to chatter despite her effort to still them. He watched her for 3 breaths. Then he reached to the side compartment, opened a small travelling case, and set a wrapped biscuit and a flask cap of watered brandy on the seat beside her. "Eat," he said. "I am not hungry." His gaze dropped to the hollow beneath her cheekbone, to the tremor she could not suppress in her fingers. "You are shaking from cold and hunger. Eat." Pride rose, useless and brittle. "I do not require charity." "This is not charity." He leaned back, eyes never leaving her face. "This is instruction." Catherine stared at the biscuit. Stale, perhaps. Plain. Her stomach tightened so hard it hurt. She broke it in half and took one measured bite, then another. Warmth and nausea chased each other through her body. She swallowed both. "Drink," he said. She took the cap of brandy, sipped, coughed at the burn, and set it down carefully before her hand could spill it. Silence returned. It was not comfortable. It was not cruel. It was the silence of 2 people measuring consequence. Outside, a church bell marked the 1/4 hour. Sleet rattled against the carriage roof like thrown seed. At last she said, "You have made my position worse." He did not pretend to misunderstand. "Explain." "If you send me back tomorrow, Lady Webber will punish what occurred tonight. If you do not send me back, she will claim I fled my duty under a gentleman's influence. Either version stains me." "She has stained you for years." The bluntness stung because it was true. Catherine lifted her chin. "You speak as if you know my life." "I know enough." "From one evening?" "From 6 weeks," he said. The carriage seemed to narrow around that line. She went still. "6 weeks?" He nodded once. "I have been reviewing the Webber Trust and the debt instruments attached to it. Your father named my brother co-executor. My brother died before he could act. The duty fell to me." Catherine heard the words and felt the floor shift under old assumptions. "No one told me this." "Lady Webber had reason not to." He reached into his inner coat and drew out a folded paper sealed with dark wax, impressed by a ducal crest. He did not hand it to her yet. He held it between 2 fingers, visible in the lamplight. "Petitions were filed in your name with signatures that vary by pressure and stroke. Disbursements were made from trust accounts on authority that does not match the codicil language. Rental income was pledged twice against separate notes. Hargreave drafted both sets." Each sentence landed like a bell in Catherine's chest, not because she had not suspected, but because suspicion spoken by power became fact that could move courts. She said quietly, "You knew at the ball." "I knew enough to set a test." The old humiliation flared. "By using me." His expression did not soften. "By letting coercion reveal itself where witnesses could not deny it." She looked down at her hands, at the raw scrape across her palm, at dried rust-brown marks under her nails that were Thomas's blood and hers together. "And if I had repeated the lie perfectly and held my tongue—" "You did repeat it perfectly." His voice dropped lower. Then you told the truth when it mattered." The carriage swayed around a corner. He braced one hand against the seat and remained very still, as if stillness itself were discipline. "I watched you for 6 weeks," he said, "at Tenant Gate meetings, where you stood outside in rain with no cloak, while Lady Webber spoke of reduced yields you had already corrected on the margin notes. At St. Bartholomew's charity table, where you gave your own bread to a widow and said you had already eaten. Tonight by the musician's stair, when you took 2 bites in the dark and returned to work. On the ballroom floor, when everyone with rank stepped back from broken glass. And you stepped in." Catherine forgot to breathe for a moment. "Not from romance. From the stark shock of being seen in particulars she had hidden to survive. "You watched me," she said. "Yes." "Why?" His hand tightened once on his gloves, then relaxed. "Because documents can be forged. Conduct cannot." The words settled between them, irreversible. She looked at him fully then, tall, even-seated, shoulders filling the carriage corner, face cut hard by lamplight and old grief, a man accustomed to command, to obedience, to war's arithmetic, a man who had caught Lady Webber's wrist in public and made it law in one sentence that she would not touch Catherine again. He spoke before she could shape a reply. "You will not return to that house tonight. Tomorrow you will decide whether you return at all, and you will do it with counsel, witnesses, and the law in writing." He placed the sealed paper on the seat between them. "Not with threats in a corridor." She stared at the seal. "What is this?" "Temporary protective order draft for magistrate review at dawn. Prepared this afternoon in expectation of resistance." Expectation of resistance. He had anticipated violence, anticipated Lady Webber, anticipated her. "You planned this." "I prepared for it." She gave a short breath that was almost a laugh and not at all amused. "You speak in commands and call it preparation." His mouth moved barely, not quite a smile, gone at once. "I speak in commands when delay harms people." The carriage slowed. Through the fogged glass she saw iron gates open onto a broad drive lined with bare yews dusted white. Norfield House rose ahead in dark stone, lit at 3 lower windows and 1 upper corridor, more fortress than home in the weather. Catherine's pulse climbed again. Safety and danger sat side by side in that sight. She had left one cage and entered a structure built by a man whose power could shelter or crush with equal ease. The carriage stopped. A groom dropped the step. The Duke did not move to open the door at once. He looked at her, and for the first time since the ballroom there was something unguarded in the stillness of his face, brief and severe as winter sun. "I did not correct you," he said, each word deliberate, "because once you addressed me I could act before witnesses and put this under legal protection at once. Until the magistrate hears it, you remain under my protection." He opened the door into sleet and held out his hand. "Come inside, Miss Webber." Catherine placed her hand in his and stepped down into sleet that stung like sand against her cheeks. The greatcoat weighed on her shoulders. The drivestones were slick. Norfield House rose above them in dark plains and narrow light, too large to be called welcoming, and too ordered to be called wild. A butler opened before they reached the door, as if he had waited in the hall counting hoofbeats. "Your Grace." "Mrs. Davers," the Duke said to a woman appearing from the inner passage, grey-haired, straight-backed, apron white as frost. "Miss Webber is under my protection. She is to have the blue chamber near my library fire, dry clothes, food, and a basin for wound care. No visitors admitted without my word." Mrs. Davies looked once at Catherine's blood-marked cuff, once at the Duke's coat over her thin mantle, and inclined her head. "Yes, Your Grace, Miss Webber, come with me." Catherine drew breath to object. "Your Grace, your coat." "Keep it until morning." He held out the folded sealed paper from the carriage. "Read this by the fire. If any line is false, strike it through and write the truth beneath. I will not submit a polished lie in your name." She took the document. The wax was still warm enough to yield at the edge. "You are submitting this at dawn." "At dawn." He turned to a waiting footman. "Wake Mr. Fenwick. He rides to the magistrate with my note now. Then 2 men and a constable to Pember Lane. They will retrieve an atlas with a cracked spine from the attic room, any papers hidden in it, and the loose board cache beneath the attic stair. They will inventory every item in my steward's hand." Catherine looked up sharply. "The coins are mine, 6 shillings. They will be tagged and returned to you in the inventory." His gaze held hers. "Nothing vanishes tonight." By the time the long case clock in the East Hall struck 3, she sat at a small escritoire in the blue chamber with broth cooling untouched beside her, the Duke's paper open under candlelight. The language was blunt. Petition for immediate protective order. Petition for injunction against transfer or sale pending review. Statement of coercion at Winter Assembly before titled witnesses. She crossed out one phrase, wrote another in a steadier hand than she felt, and added details he had not heard. The red ribbon memorandum heading she had read through the study door, the altered initials in margin notes, the locked desk key kept at Lady Webber's waist, the pawn ticket for her mother's silver, the 2 tenant leases ended without arrears, the dining service marked stolen, though no servant dismissed. She signed with ink still drying when a knock sounded. The Duke stood at the threshold, not entering. "Are you finished?" "Yes." He took the pages, scanned the editions, and nodded once. "Good." His eyes paused at the line where she had written, in careful script, "Mr." Hargreave carried a packet tied in red ribbon at the ball, and concealed it when challenged. "I have sent for him to produce all associated drafts," he said. "If he refuses, the constable will search his office by writ." She hesitated. Wrexham looked as if he wished to speak and did not. "Then he may speak under oath." He turned to go, then stopped without looking back. "You did not eat?" "I could not." "Try again." His voice remained level. "You require strength more than pride before sunrise." At dawn, the sleet had turned to hard rain. Magistrates' chambers on Chancery Lane smelled of wet wool, sealing wax, and old paper. Catherine sat at a narrow table between Mrs. Davies and Mr. Fenwick, the Duke's steward, while clerks moved in and out with bundles tied in twine. The Duke stood near the hearth, dark coat buttoned to the throat, hat in hand, as if he had slept in none of the hours between. Lady Webber entered in mourning silk and perfect gloves, Eliza and Margaret behind her with rigid faces, Hargreave at her shoulder carrying no red ribbon now, only a leather case clutched too tightly. The magistrate, Sir Lionel Braith, did not waste courtesy. "This court hears petition regarding the Weber Trust and allegations of coercion and assault. We will proceed by document, then by witness." Fenwick stepped forward first and laid out an inventory sheet. "Recovered at 6:40 this morning from Pember Lane attic room under constable authority. 1 cracked atlas containing 4 handwritten pages of copied ledger notes by Miss Catherine Webber, 1 scrap with memorandum heading in her hand, 6 shillings in coin from loose board, sealed and tagged, 1 pawn ticket bearing Lady Webber's signature, and 2 household ledgers with overwritten entries." The magistrate adjusted his spectacles. "Marked and admitted provisionally." A constable then placed a second bundle on the table, red ribbon, damp at the knot. "Seized at Hargreave and Bell, Bishop Street," he said. "Draft instruments against anticipated dowry assets, duplicate pledges on northern rents, and 3 signature exemplars." Hargreave made a strangled sound. "Sir Lionel, this is irregular." "Sit down, Mr. Hargreave," the magistrate said. You will have your turn." Catherine testified standing. She did not embellish. She gave the words Lady Webber had ordered her to repeat. She described the threat in the corridor and the raised hand in the ballroom. She named each ledger, change she had observed, and where she had found corroborating marks. Her voice shook only once, when Sir Lionel asked why she had copied figures by night. "Because I had no key," she said, "and because numbers altered when I left the room." Wrexham testified after her, face grey with fatigue. He admitted he had believed Lady Webber's assurances for months because he had wanted his exposure covered without scandal. He admitted he had heard her call Catherine useful as coin. He admitted he saw the raised hand. The matron from the ballroom confirmed the same in clipped tones, cheeks pink with humiliation at being dragged from drawing rooms into truth. Nursemaid Ellis gave statement that Miss Webber alone stopped the child's bleeding while others stepped back. Dr. Hale confirmed the bandage had been properly applied. Eliza and Margaret were called. Eliza said she could not recall. Margaret said she had been looking away. The magistrate wrote both answers, then wrote beside them. Witness offered no contradiction. By noon Sir Lionel had read the codicil the Duke produced from his executor file, seal intact, witnessed years earlier. It named trust protections that Lady Webber's instruments violated on their face. He set down the document and spoke directly to Lady Webber. "Your authority over Miss Webber's person and property is suspended pending full assize review. Accounts are frozen. Instruments executed against this trust are stayed. You will vacate the Pember Lane townhouse within 24 hours and submit keys to court custody." Lady Webber's composure broke for the first time. "You cannot put me out of my own house." Sir Lionel did not blink. "Madam, it was never solely yours." She turned toward Catherine then, fury stripped of perfume. The Duke stepped half a pace between them, not touching, enough. Lady Webber said very low, "Ungrateful girl." Catherine met her eyes. "No, I was hungry." The constable took Lady Webber's keys. Hargreave asked for adjournment and received censure instead. Wrexham bowed to Catherine in the corridor after, awkward and formal. "I should have asked questions sooner," he said. "Yes," she answered. He looked as if more might come, then only said, "I am sorry," and went. By the second week of April, rain had lifted and pale sun touched the stone steps at the Spring Assizes reception, where the same names that had watched her humiliation now formed two lines, and pretended memory had always been just. Catherine wore dove-grey silk, cut simply. Her mother's opal comb returned from court inventory set in her dark hair by Mrs. Davis's careful hands. She stood near an open window while voices rose and fell around legal gossip and harvest forecasts. The Duke crossed the room and stopped before her. No one interrupted, no one dared. "Miss Webber," he said, and held out his hand. She looked at it, broad and steady, the hand that had caught a wrist in mid-air and signed orders before dawn. "Your Grace, I did not correct you, because I could not bear to lose sight of you." He said it in the same tone he used for commands, which made it truer. Catherine placed her hand in his, and did not lower her eyes. "Then do not lose it now." His fingers closed once around hers. Not possession. Promise. At Norfield Chapel, 3 mornings later, the pews held only those who had stood where truth was expensive. Mrs. Davies, Fenwick, Dr. Hale, Nursemaid Ellis with Thomas, scrubbed solemn and proud in a blue coat, too large at the sleeves. He carried the ring cushion with both hands and did not stumble. The vicar's voice echoed softly under stone. Catherine spoke her vows clearly. The Duke spoke his as if each word were a binding order accepted with full knowledge of cost. When it was done, Thomas grinned up at Catherine and whispered, "Your hand is better." "So is yours," she whispered back, and he flexed his bandaged, now healed fingers to prove it. That afternoon she rode to Pember Lane by choice, not summons. Court officers had finished inventory. Lady Webber had been removed to a distant relation's house under debt supervision, barred from managing Webber accounts pending final judgment. Eliza and Margaret had departed with her and sent no messages. Hargreaves' practice was suspended. The red ribbon draft sat sealed in magistrates' evidence rooms, tagged, numbered, no longer able to vanish into polite fire. Catherine walked through her father's front hall slowly, hand trailing the banister worn smooth by years that had belonged to her before they were taken. In the study the lock had been changed. Fenwick placed a new key in her palm. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, testing the title with respect, "all items recovered are accounted for. The 6 shillings are in your desk drawer. The atlas and your copied pages are filed in the lower cabinet with the court duplicates. The pearl box from the assembly was never entered to your person and is noted abandoned in Lady Webber's surrendered effects." "Thank you, Mr. Fenwick." She crossed to the window where winter light had once found her father bent over ledgers. The Duke stood in the doorway and did not intrude on that first silence. When she turned, he was still there, tall against the frame, watchful as ever. "Do you wish to keep this house?" he asked, "or sell it?" She looked at the room, at dust lifted into gold by late sun, at the desk where figures had once been honest before fear taught people to erase. "I wish to keep it," she said, "and run it properly." His mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. "Good." He closed the study door behind him, and the latch settled with a sound like a verdict finally entered